Chair.
If everyone could get ready to... I don't know if this works. Hello? Can it, is the mic on? Or are people just ignoring me? Let's, if everyone could gather in their respective places or wherever they want to be, we need to go ahead and get this meeting going. So it is now officially called to order. We welcome everyone. We have two new members, and so it might be appropriate for beginning over here just to introduce yourself, and then when it gets to the two new members, you can say a little something about yourself, and then after that we'll get on with the substance of the meeting.
My name's Mike Reeser. I serve as Chancellor of the Texas State Technical College System.
I'm Dan Mims, serve on the Board of Trustees for San Jacinto Community College in Houston.
Cheryl Sparks, and I serve in the role of President of Howard College.
Good morning, Lonnie Howard, Lamar Institute of Technology, President.
Good morning, Ricardo Solis, President of Laredo College.
And I'm Ron Walker. I'm a trustee at Victoria College.
Good morning. I'm Brenda Kays, President of Kilgore College.
Mark Williams, trustee at Austin Community College.
I'm Cesar Maldonado, Chancellor of Houston Community College. I guess I am a new member, although I know everybody here, some better than others. It's a pleasure to be here and be part of this esteemed group as we look to helping the state of Texas with our educational challenges. The Houston area depends heavily on the work that this group does in the coordinating board, so it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Pam Boehm, and I know most of you, I think. I'm president of Hill College, been at Hill College 30 years, and so I've been in the business a long time. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and look forward to working with you all.
Good morning. Armin Cantu, Galveston College.
Howdy, Rex Weaver, downtown Killeen, Central Texas College, and I think I'm one of the original members of this organization, probably the only trustee left that was originally part of the group.
Hi, K. Paul Holt, Board Chair at McClellan College in Waco.
Well, thank you. They always remind me to remind you, and I think they're really talking about reminding me, that this is being webcast. So everything anyone does and says is available for public viewing. So with that in mind, we have a summary of the notes from last meeting. I think hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to look over those. I don't think we officially adopt them, but if there are any changes, let me know. The one change, or the very last item, it said Ron Walker discussed, I think the entire board discussed, focusing this meeting exclusively, but I think it should be probably mainly, to the dual credit reports, if they are available. Well, there's a lot of available information out there about dual credit, even though the heirs has not been comments and changes made because of those comments. So with everyone's permission and a visit with some of you, we might change the format a little bit and talk about dual credit and maybe break it down into what I call student success, the counseling aspect of it, the rigor, and the financial aspects of it. And then have a discussion of each of those, instead of somebody making a presentation and 30 minutes later somebody else make a presentation, have them make them simultaneously talk. And so I visited with Rex and Jacob about maybe doing that, And of course, I think we need to participate. We need to ask questions, make comments. We're in a different set of trenches than a lot of these other people are. So anyway, let's just have a nice discussion about dual credit and focusing on each of these items and somebody else who. And John, you're the legislative guy, policy, you know, we want you to jump in because if there are going to be some policies coming out concerning dual credit, we certainly want you to be a part of this discussion. So we also welcome Dr. Gardner is with us today. I know we had a couple of presidents. Brenda Helger was there. I think she stepped out. David Hines is here. I think we have, they're here for some legislative things. So welcome to the visitors. Dr. Gardner, sometimes you throw out a couple of words. If you have any on dual credit, we'll certainly, I've said a couple of words. Obviously, you can use more than a couple if you have any comments.
Dual credit is important. I'll leave it at that.
I think we can adjourn now. Okay.
Discussion of dual credit.
Jacob Rose, would whoever wants to come up, Jacob, and again, we had talked about it, so it would be interesting. And there's the AIR study. There's some other studies. I think TAC and CAT have both issued some statements on that. But so whoever wants to jump in, let's talk about what studies, what results, and also what we have seen individually at our own campuses concerning the success or lack thereof of dual credit. And but let's really talk about student success. Is it working? Is it, you know, is it a good thing?
Before we get started, I'm sure we'll get to this point, but I think it'll be extremely valuable if we segregate dual credit into some of its components. Because I know during testimony yesterday, we talked about early college, high school, we talked about P-TECH, we talked about for-credit, dual credit versus technical. And I think each of these components kind of function differently. They're funded differently, so it might be helpful in terms of adding to the conversation to kind of put those actual titles to each category, as opposed to clumping everything into dual credit.
I think that's good. You want to just start out maybe first with what's sometimes termed as traditional dual credit, and then maybe we can get into early high school, and there's an earlier discussion about some of the workforce work credit. So anyway, is that too nebulous to begin?
No, I think that's vague enough. As a good starting point, yes, I think it is. I mean, I think to Dr. Howard's point, I think it's good to point out that there really are, and there may be more, but there is academic dual credit versus CTE dual credit. And while they have some similarities, they also have some differences as well. And I think it's also important to point out that within each of those two things, you can have an early college high school model, which can take the form of the traditional early college high school, which was originally conceived as an academic transfer mechanism. But now you also have the P-TECH, which falls under that same kind of an umbrella of an early college high school model. The CTE academies, the ICAs, the industry cluster academies that were funded funds by and through TWC by both TEA and the Coordinating Board and the Workforce Commission as well, that all contributed funds to this and oversight for it. And so within those, you know, so you have these two, and then within those you have those separate kind of models as well. And again, while there are similarities between them, there's also some big differences, I think, especially between, for lack of a better way to put it, you know, dual credit versus the early college high school model in all of its forms, by the way, which would include the traditional plus also P-TECH and ICAs and even other forms of it that are out there. Even the old, what they call that, the middle school conception was really a forerunner of early college high schools, and there's still one of those left in Texas. I believe Temple, at least until recently, still operated one of those. So, and they, you know, the difference between a lot of those revolves around one of the most important issues, which is advising, which came up a lot yesterday in the hearing, and the importance of putting students on the right track. Because what we know is while dual credit reduces a student's time in college after high school, as though they weren't spending any time in college while they were in dual credit. I find kind of an interesting concept all by itself. But at least after high school, their time in college is reduced, and we know that that can be up to a semester on average. But we also know that on average, they take approximately 6 semester credit hours, more than students who don't take dual credit. So that may or may not go back to the advising piece, which again, everybody I think conceives of as being very important. And I think a piece of the AIR study that you guys probably know as much about it as anybody does is the funding piece of it and how that works itself out. And we know that as dual credit has become a larger and larger portion of a college's enrollment, then the question of whether you give that dual credit away, or you charge partially for it, or you charge full freight for it, and your ability to do so has some impact on your ability to fund your colleges and fund other programs and operate in the black, if you will. So I think there are a lot of interesting differences there. And I think one of the things that we should keep in mind that if you look at all of the, if you look at the 3 studies in the report that have come out, if you look at the UT system study that Dr. Troutman talked about yesterday, the AIR study that Dr. Miller talked about yesterday, the report from the Dual Credit Task Force, even if you go back and look at Michael Villarreal's study as well, what you will find is that you know, one of the takeaways I get from those is that dual credit has by and large been a good thing. And while the findings are different, some of the methodology is different, I think the message is pretty consistent, that for the most part and for the vast majority of students that have been involved in dual credit, it has indeed been a good thing. And so going forward, how do we make sure that it remains a good thing, and how do we make sure that it's appropriately funded so that it can remain a good thing as well?
I'd just like to briefly add, if I could, an emphasis on what Rex just said is, from the coordinating board perspective, is that dual credit served a great purpose, and we want it to continue to as it expands. And I think we just need to underline that more. I do want to add another variation that Rex did mention, which is in David Troutman's study, is that he also includes dual enrollment as offered through UT Austin and Texas Tech, which is a different structure as well. And so just another little different texture. I heard from someone at Tech yesterday that, you know, they've just entered doing the dual enrollment. They have 700 students now. So there are a lot of different pieces, as Jacob pointed out yesterday, that it's fairly complex, there's a lot of variations. And so, but the main point is there's a lot of evidence that it serves students well, and we want to make sure as we expand, it continues to serve students well. And there are things we can continue to do better. And frankly, things we can learn from early college high schools in terms of, are there some services there that people that aren't in early college high schools perhaps should have access to for different reasons, but we don't know what those are.
So I agree, Dr. Gardner. I think everything you just stated. I would add, Chairman Walker, maybe a little bit more context before we go back into the weeds, although I think the weed discussion is super critical. We're also talking about a shading of lines between 2 sectors of education. So we had traditionally sort of accepted this notion, and K-12 certainly is more than a century old, and God knows higher education is multiple centuries in its evolution. But we have traditionally accepted this notion that students graduate from compensatory education and then begin the process of enrolling in higher education. And dual credit is challenging essentially both systems and challenging the norms of both systems because we quite literally have high school students, and in some cases, high school freshmen and high school sophomores taking college courses. And so this is a part of that challenge. And I think to David's point, and then there's sort of multiple iterations and multiple modalities of delivery of what we call dual credit or early enrollment or dual enrollment. And we haven't even talked about homeschoolers, frankly, who are not even in any of the systems and yet are still taking college courses at community colleges by and large that are college-graded courses. So this is as complex as I said yesterday as our systems of education. So I think that's part of the context. The other part of the context to your question about success is that even within the academy, the definition of student success is evolving and has evolved, I would argue, in the last sort of 15 to 20 years than what it had been in the first sort of 20 to 30 years since even LPJ signed the Higher Education Act and declared that we need to make higher education really available to all families, not just those with wherewithal to pay for higher education. And we're in maybe the first 2 or 3 decades of at least federal statute, and I know this agency was also authorized in the same year in 1965. In the first decades, it really was about providing even more access to people of color, specifically, and to low-income families who had traditionally not just not had access to higher ed, but frankly had not even looked at higher education as something that was a viable opportunity for them. And so we collectively sort of moved race in some cases to that end, and it was an important end. And I think if you look at, for example, some of the successes of the Closing the Gaps plan, which is the predecessor to 60 by 30, some of the successes were in large part because we were moving to make sure that we had more students coming to our campuses. The definition of success began to iterate across the board, but particularly I'll speak to community colleges, when we looked at the data and understood that many of our students were coming to our campuses and not completing, and coming to our campuses and not walking out with a credential, whether it's a certificate or an associate's degree, or they didn't transfer on to get a baccalaureate degree. And so I think there was an earnest conversation about how do we define success? Is it good enough to have more low-income students come to campuses if not more low-income students are graduating from campuses? And there were some national data, frankly, that is scary. There are some national data that show you that among low-income families, I think that the total is a percentage of the whole. The total percent of low-income families who have actually now have a post-secondary credential is only changed by 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points over a 20 or 30-year period. So we still have a long way to go, both on the access side and then the success side. So I share that with it as a context. The other context to understand is that Texas is changing dramatically. The majority of Texas students in public school today are low-income students. And these are the students that are going to be coming to our campuses in the very short term. We're not talking 20 or 30 years from now, but very short term. And dual credit is sort of the early, I know we're familiar with the canary in the coal mine analogy. These are the early indicators, right? And so this is part of the struggles in terms of what we're dealing with. So that's the context. I would concur, Dr. Gardner and Dr. Peebles, that dual credit as we have it today, 151,000 students, 10% of all high school students, 20% of all community college enrollment, 10% of all higher education enrollment is working. It is working on multiple measures, and it is working on even some intangible measures that we have been talking about a number of years. Exposure to the higher education experience, exposure to faculty members, so that, as I think Dr. Trotman, eloquently said yesterday, so that higher education is not a foreign concept to them. Many of us are first in our family to go to college. This is no longer a rare occasion, but this is becoming more and more of a norm. The non-traditional student, which is a new phrase that is being coined, is becoming the norm. And for our students that are coming to dual credit, a college course beyond the content, and we'll talk about content in a minute in terms of rigor, but a college course is no longer a foreign concept. It's no longer something that is happening to someone else in my school, but it's someone else in my family. And I think that's an important iteration of this process. I think with regards to the conversation of rigor, and yesterday I think there was good extensive discussion on that point. What I would add to today, in addition to what was said yesterday, is that that we have, I'll speak for TACC, that we have concluded that there is no problem with the content that our students have been learning as a measure of rigor does not at all indicate that we should not continue to be conscientious and monitoring that quality of instruction continue. These are not mutually exclusive objectives. We must do that. If for no other reason, for academic institutions, because the accreditors are aware of that. Yesterday, even in the middle of that hearing, we heard from one of our presidents who had just completed his visit or their visit from SAC-COC, and the visit was specifically to look at their dual credit portfolio for that college. The accreditors are very much aware of this issue, and rightfully so, and we invite them to our campuses and we invite them to the conversation because none of us should lose sight that we want to provide a quality instruction to our students, whether they are a high school sophomore, all of age 15, or a 30-year-old coming back for their very first credential, having been in the workforce. And so those are not mutually exclusive. And I want to make sure that we hear that, so that it is not another 10 years, Dr. Gardner, before we have the conversation again, but it is 2 years and 3 years from now where we continue to visit. And if there are spaces among community colleges, and frankly, among some of our university colleagues who are entering this space, if we find gaps in that, then let's talk about it and let's make sure that we iron those wrinkles earlier rather than later. And so that's sort of my perspective on the issue of rigor. I think with regards to sort of finding some norms, maybe advising is an area where we can find some norms. The different modalities of dual credit, it makes it a little complex, right? So you have online dual credit where the faculty of record is a high school teacher, and there's a high school teacher who's providing the instruction, but there's a faculty of record back at university in some cases. And then there are some modalities where our colleges will send the faculty to the high school, and there's some modalities where the high school teacher is credentialed to teach that course, and therefore they become an adjunct faculty for a college. And so I think some of those differentiations in delivery of instruction, frankly, should continue because we want to be agile, we want to be organic to meet the needs of that community. And I will call out specifically our rural communities as an area of rural communities do not have access, and I know you know this, do not have access to adjunct faculty who are credentialed and who are qualified at the ready. They are dependent on full-time faculty to teach a dual credit course no differently than they are with our non-dual credit traditional courses. And that's an expensive proposition, as we all know. And so I think with regards to the delivery modality, certainly we can learn. And one of the areas where we can learn, and I think this came out in a couple of the studies, and I know it came out very specifically in the conversations that we had with the dual credit task force, is in faculty professional development. In faculty professional development. I would argue, writ large, dual credit notwithstanding, writ large, there's probably no norms in terms of faculty development across the academy. Across the academy. That you get your PhD and you're now teaching at a university, does not necessarily mean that you know how to teach. It just means that you're a master of that discipline. And I don't mean that to knock it. I'm just saying that the norms in terms of faculty development is an area that we can work with, and we can work with offline. And by that, I mean, I don't know that we need state policy state prescribed policy in terms of what that looks like. I think we just need to work together and make sure that we have a grounding of what that might look like, what is a best practice on that, and then begin to implement those pieces. I'll stop there.
Okay. Let's get in, okay, go ahead.
Yes.
Make sure your mic is on.
It's not, thank
Okay.
you. Even when something is generally working well, and I think when you talk about advising, it points to that, you always need to look to see if you can do better at it. And I think that some things have come up that, at least in spots, if not overall, that and advising is one. Advising is a problem at every level of education. But we should always look to improve what we're doing, even when we're doing well. So we want to make sure that as we expand, we keep doing the good things. But I think at the same time, we can look towards, are there things we can do better from what we've learned already? And that's the case of any good program, whether it's education or industry. You always want to look how to make it better. And so, but when you do that, it doesn't mean that overall you're not doing well. It's just you're doing well. And so I think we need to make sure we don't forget that. And I think that was embedded in what you were saying as well. And because this is important. And I do, and those of you who haven't read 60 by 30 carefully, I want to point out that one of the things we point out is a concern about whether economically disadvantaged students have adequate access to dual credit at this point. And that's not a criticism, it's just a reminder we need to make sure, as Jacob was pointing out, there's some populations that you may need to work harder at getting them the resources that they're perfectly capable of taking advantage of, but they don't always get that access. And there are pockets where we have some concerns about that. I think we all do.
Well, we're flying about 10,000 feet. Why don't we kind of drill down into some of the things that are actually going on? We have a legislature that it's about to meet that's going to probably have some effect on dual credit. There are reports out there. If you read the Texas Tribune, there's controversy concerning various reports, and the heirs and Dr. Villarreal have kind of been dueling back and forth. But I think it's important that with those reports out there, we know we get an accurate representation of what's going on, so that any policy that comes out of it is based on good data. I'm not an expert in methodology, but can you all speak to the controversy? And if there's no controversy, let me know, but I'll be very skeptical if you say that, about the various dueling reports that are out there. And it specifically, I think, goes to the issue of how well dual credit is being delivered and how well the students who receive dual credit are doing after they leave that program and go to college. So open it up to anyone who wants to handle that.
So I'll take a stab at this. So the main controversy has come over the differences in methodology between the AIR study and the study that Michael Villarreal did. And I will not try to parse out the differences in those methodologies because I was telling I think I was talking to Rose right before the meeting, and I was pointing out that I was reading something this morning about dark matter, which is what is theoretically is supposed to occupy 70% of the matter in the universe is dark matter. And it's called dark matter because we can't see it or find it. But I was struck by the fact that there's probably at least dozens of astrophysicists and physicists out there who are constantly going back and forth over methodological issues about finding dark matter, measuring dark matter, what percentage of the universe is it, and so on and so on. And they duel constantly about the methodology. And in some respects, I think that's what you have with the Villarreal and the AIRO studies, is that you have different methodologies being used. I think what's important to keep in mind about it is that in spite of the fact that they use different methodologies, they both arrive in pretty much the same place. And that is that dual credit has been effective. And that it does have an impact on students, both whether they go to college or not, and most importantly, whether they then finish college or not and complete it. And if you really look at both of those studies, the differences that they identify are measured in tenths of a percentage point in terms of the impact of both of those things. And so I think, again, I think both of them arrive in the same place, and that is that dual credit has been a good thing. And so I'll leave it at that unless people have questions, or unless, David, you want to.
Well, I guess one of the questions I have is, maybe the AIRS report, in my reading of it, and in editorials written around the state, people get the misconception that the AIRS report is downplaying the success of dual credit. That's the way I read it. That's the feel I get. So I think a comment would be to the AIRS report for them to do what you just said. Yes, it is good, and obviously it needs improvement, but I think they could be a little more straightforward in saying dual credit is good for the state, because we have a legislature that's going to be making a lot of decisions. So if the AIRS report really believes that, I think they need to be more forceful in saying it, because I just don't get it.
If I could comment, number one, while funded by foundations and working with a coordinating board, this isn't an independent report. So I just want to emphasize that. We have talked with them a lot about, especially the executive summary, making it more clear, because all of you have been in the newspaper, and you know they will pick up certain things. And I think what they picked up on was from our board meeting, the investigator used, I've forgotten what the particular point was, and our board chair will, that doesn't sound very significant. Well, when you use the word significant with an economist, that means something different than it does to all of us. So he responded as an economist and a statistician, rather than saying, yeah, and he said in other forums, that may not look like it's, but it is. And so nobody, maybe a few of us the report is about 300 pages. I've read it, and we've pointed out there things, even if you just go and look at the conclusions, that it would be helpful were in the executive summary. We think it would be helpful if the executive summary spoke to a non-research audience. And I think part of what you heard yesterday was speaking toward, as a researcher, to people who aren't researchers. And we're hoping to get that more clear. We certainly are making it more clear in our own remarks. But it is problematic. When I read that first article, I mean, it didn't, to me, read as though all the takeaways from this. And I think we do need to make the point up front. We do think this is a good thing. A good thing can get better. And there are some specific things which I think Rex's point was really on point, is all of these point out that it's beneficial. And one thing that hadn't been mentioned directly, but in one part of the AIR study, it does not include early college, high school students, primarily because it was accepted they work, because there's a real culture there. It's a very different environment than a person who may take a dual credit course, to try to focus in on that large number of students. But early college, high school is included, schools are included in the rest of the report. But that isn't evident from the way it was presented. And so I agree with what you're saying. I think, I mean, all of us in this room from the coordinating board have been trying to think, how can we help the communication of what I, at least personally, see as a supporter of dual credit. And one final comment in reference to what Rick said. I felt frequently that I'm at a professional conference where you've got tables of researchers arguing about the weaknesses of each other's studies. That's common. I can tell you every one of these things isn't perfect. The David Troutman study only talks about people going to UT schools. Does that mean it's not a good study? No, it doesn't. there are important findings from there. So I think one has to look at what are the commonalities, as Rex was pointing out, and in some cases, one will look at something that the other didn't look at, and I think that's a plus. If they all did exactly the same study, I think we wouldn't benefit as much. But I think your comment is right on point. How do we get the real story out? Because it did come across as though, from that first article I read, I guess, in the morning news, that it wasn't very effective, essentially. And I don't think that was what the investigator was saying. I'm sorry I talked so much.
That's great. Good insight. On the AIR report, and as you said, it did come across, I thought, relatively negative towards dual credit when I, first saw the results. And certainly in the Tribune article, that the op-ed, I guess, wasn't very complimentary of the report. I think the concern that I have, and the concern that trustees around the country and the constituents whom we represent, dual credit's important. My children are grown, but they were both dual credit students, and daughter went to A&M, and she went in with over a semester's worth of credit, so yes, that's pretty important. And I believe that, this report is being viewed by our legislators, and they're going to be making decisions, as Ron mentioned earlier, and John, you may want to speak to it, but I think we have to be concerned because they're going to be making decisions that affect families and affect lives, and if it's flawed information or a flawed perception of the information, that's not a good thing, and we need to get ahead of that. We need to fix it. I just think it was a very poor report. Just a personal opinion. When I read through the information that I was presented and read through the methodologies, I just think it's a flawed report, and I think we got to get ahead of that, make sure our legislators aren't making bad decisions that negatively affect families around the state of Texas that depend on dual credit.
If I could just talk briefly about that last remark. Going back to what I said, virtually any research you find has flaws in it. And I just think we have to recognize that, and frequently it comes down to, do you disagree about the findings? I think everyone, both David Troutman and Trey Miller, are very good researchers. One happens to do a better job of presenting, I think. But I think it isn't methodologically flawed in the sense that it's a bad study. If it is, then you have to dismiss the fact that it has positive findings as well, which it does. But I think that the issue is, and it's a problem of many researchers in the policy arena, I'm talking, I was once one of those, is that you tend to focus on what was different that you find rather than the other. In a policy arena, that's not where you should start. I think that's the fundamental flaw. It's not the methods, because there's always something you don't address. There's always something you don't address. There's things that aren't even discussed. The advising part hasn't been discussed much, which is a significant part of the study. There's a cost study that no one else has really done before, which I think is very interesting. It's gotten no attention whatsoever. I should say it points out that community colleges are only getting 77%, I think it is, of their costs for delivering this. I mean, there are many things in there that it's very hard to get at unless you're willing to sit and read almost 300 pages and then go back and read it again because it's very dense. And I think that's part of the challenge, is pulling out those things that are significant to people and not getting bogged down in the methodology.
And I think, to follow up on David's point, I mean, the important thing here and where we need to improve is framing the takeaways from the report. We've had a lot of conversation here already about how the report does find that dual credit has been and continues to be an effective outcome for students, or has effective outcomes for students. I think there was some confusion at first between the Troutman and the AIR study in terms of Troutman was looking at descriptive evidence to show that those who took dual credit had successful outcomes, And what the AIR study tried to do was control for the fact that those students were probably more likely to go on to college and were more motivated to go to college anyway. And so the AIR report tried to control for just does dual credit in and of itself have a positive outcome for enrollment and graduation? And the answer was yes. The evidence demonstrated that dual credit does have that outcome. We need to do a better job of making that point at the outset. And as David mentioned, we also need to do a better job of making the points about the other 5 elements of this study. So far, the conversation has been around just one element of the study. But we do find that, particularly the cost element, that I believe, the state's reaping 5 times the benefit of the actual cost of providing dual credit. So again, I do think there's a lot of opportunity for us here to do a better job of saying, particularly legislators, here are the key takeaways from the AIR report, how they line up with or may disagree with any other studies. And I also want to talk a little bit on this early college high school component of it, because this was a lot of conversation about this at the hearing yesterday. And I understand that there was a sense that excluding early college high school semester credit hours from the outcomes component of the study, there was a sense that it may have skewed the result. But as I understand it, basically the AIR study started from the premise that early college high school has been demonstrated to be a successful intervention, that there's national studies that show that early college high schools are benefiting students, that the services that they provide, that the culture that they have of degree attainment has been pretty clearly demonstrated to be successful. And so the study wanted to look at what had not been as closely studied, which is the impact of dual credit provided through traditional high schools. And so that's why the focus was on that, was essentially to say we have this field that we haven't looked as closely at. Let's see what we're getting out of it. And again, the answer was we're having successful outcomes. There are some concerns that we need to look at. Academically underprepared students don't benefit as much from dual credit. There's apparently the advising is relatively kind of all over the place in terms of who provides it and how students are guided to and through dual credit. But that, again, it's been largely successful. So, the challenge we always have is, like David said, 300-page study. How do you get it down to a one-pager that's going to communicate to the legislature the key things that they need to know?
I think, though, if I can say, that when press and individuals pick that up as dual credit, then it becomes a blanket statement. And we started this conversation by stating there are various types of dual credit programs, and it's important to note that. Press doesn't do that. So it behooves us, particularly as the coordinating board, to maybe come out in front of that, to identify the specifics of the study. And I know that it was an AIR study, but by the linkage with coordinating board, in a sense becomes a coordinating board type of study. And that's unfortunate, because I know you all had to play some defense on that. Having done control and treatment types of research, it's difficult, and I know that, to have a clean control group. And that is what I think the AIR folks were trying to get to. When you mix it up with AP students being in there and other students that are college-going type students, I probably think the effect size would have been larger, notably so, if that was a cleaner version. We live in a day and age where you can't select, when you have human subjects, all these different types of students. But again, making sure when the executive summary comes out, knowing who that audience is, and they might not have that latitude in terms of the expertise and research methodology, is so important, because we need to get it right. Dual credit did more for this whole idea of college-going culture than I think most any other program, because it embeds college in high school. And that's one thing that we haven't really explicitly said, is we're not talking about a college-going culture. We've already embedded that in our high schools that are participating in dual credit. And what an amazing thing that we've done. I think at this point, knowing that we have the air study, we have the Troutman study, we have Dr. Vial's study, we have other studies out there as well, by the way. Having a meta-analysis to take a look at all the rich data, and then coordinating board coming in and providing recommendations, I think would be very important, because there's, as you said, there's very important takeaways from each one of these studies, and it's going to be a lot to go through, but this is the right time, right before the legislature comes to town, because some of these things don't need to be touched. Some things demand a state policy intervention. But I think before we look at the air study in exclusion of some of those others, I think it's necessary. I think the meta-analysis would be helpful to really provide a big, broad picture of what is being done in dual credit, what are the great takeaways, and then where do we need to go in terms of state policy to make it even better.
If I could add just two more, I think that's perfect. Dark matter. No, I'm looking for a researcher. So this is a terrible plug for I'm looking for a researcher. So, distinction between scholarly research and policy research, right? We have to create, we have to authorize, we have to commission multiple researchers to understand very complex issues, whether it's a scientific research or a social science research, to understand that. And we should have multiple views, unequivocally. But the context is a policy context. We have legislators who are going to make decisions here in the short order that could very well affect the direction of not just 151,000 students, but possibly 200 or whatever the North Star is in terms of the enrollment in dual credit that we aspire for the next decade. And there are some bells that cannot be unrung. And I think what is unfortunate over the last 6 weeks is not that we didn't have a good, healthy discussion. I welcome a healthy discussion. Sherman, you said earlier about having a nice conversation. I think we should always have good collegial conversations, but we had it in a public domain. We didn't have it in these kinds of rooms. We had it in a public domain, and that's unfortunate. And so, yes, there's a difference between Dr. Villarreal and Dr. Miller with regards to the selected methodology and the treatments that occurred. I'm a lay person. My professors at the LBG school would not be proud for me to say that I don't know that I'm nuanced enough to understand those two differences, but that there are differences, so be it. I think that going forward, if we can continue to have the conversation internally and then learn from all of it, learn from the larger, and I think this is what Dr. Martinez was talking about, from the larger body of knowledge in this space, and not just have one study informed one editorial board, which frankly led the conversation. And so now we're at a different place. I mean, I think yesterday, I, for one, walked out of that knowing and understanding that, at least on the Senate side, there was resound interest and support for us to go down this path. And to your point, Dr. Gardner, and to make the improvements that are necessary, because there are some improvements. But I think, Sherman, I would just add that I think we're at a different place than we were maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. And certainly welcome the continued iteration of the draft air report in the executive summary, because communication matters.
Let me add, I know Jacob knows, and I'm not sure all of you know, that we had made a commitment some months ago to have our major policy issue at our October board meeting on this subject, and to invite David Troutman, to have Trey there. We were thinking it would be Jacob, but somebody from the task force or the Community College Association talking about that, and also to add in someone who's done work nationally in terms of early college high schools to that discussion. So this is a decision we actually made some time ago, and Rex is going to lead that and hopefully sit down all those individuals a month beforehand to talk about how to best present this. But that was a commitment we made quite a while ago. And, and looking back, I think there was an attempt to be open and transparent by saying, here's where this study stands at this point, so that then people could comment on it. And by opening it up like that, it created some of these other issues. But I know, we don't know what they're doing yet, but I know AIR is sitting and has been, the deadline for those comments was the 31st, reviewing those comments. And I know, just from a brief conversation with Trey, they're looking at some things that maybe they ought, not just the executive summary, but maybe there's some things they could tweak. I don't know what those are going to be. But you also need to know, when you work with associations like that, where there's AIR or RAND, the researchers have to go through their own review process. And even their public statements are reviewed by their organization. So Rose is correct, and we've been having lots of these conversations, but there's a control factor outside this that we always know when we hire an independent research group, that there's that piece that we have to recognize. And they could have come out with a study that was not positive. So you always run that risk. But I think while we haven't had a meta-analysis, without doing much, we know that everyone's saying that dual credit's something important and we should continue. And I think in a way we're helping some of the other discussion by diverting into some of these things which can distract and make it think that somebody's thinking it's not a good effort to help students. And I commented to Jacob, after the hearing yesterday, I thought he did a nice job in concluding that, hey, there's some things, that, these courses are being offered in a way that's comparable. This didn't come up yesterday, but I'm not sure if I've said this to Jacob, but we all know that even within an institution, that you could, courses offered on campus, that you might have 10 professors and they're not doing all exactly the same thing, but they're in the same ballpark. And I think this was a very, even though it was a small number of courses, it was very intense. I mean, they really looked at the product of students. Trey did not do that work. They had curriculum experts looking at this, and their curriculum experts came to the conclusion that these are really equivalent courses. And, there needs to be more time to talk about some of those things than whether, early college high schools were included or not, and I can see why one might want them to be. But, as Rose was pointing out, if you want to control for certain things, you can't do that with the early college high school students included in there, but you can in the general population through a quasi-experimental approach. It's difficult there as well. So I hope that we at least take away that I think we all agree we could do better messaging, that overall nobody's ever 100% in agreement, but I think we're in agreement that dual credit's important to students, and we need to find a way to continue. And I think we need to try to focus on that going forward to make sure we get out the right message, because I think your point is right on target.
Well, I think we all like to have concrete results, and all, but I think what I'm getting from the staff is you don't have to be anchored by the AIRS report. I was not suggesting that you try to influence the report, but you can take the AIRS report along with other report. You guys are expert, you know what's going on, and you can issue your own opinion on dual credit. I mean, I don't think you need to tie yourself to the cross of the AIRS report. I think you can make your own decisions. And so I think that's important. And I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Not to the level of a meta-analysis, but it seems like we're spending a lot of time over some words in an executive summary. Do we have a table that shows the numbers that are the drivers of all of these reports to look at the comparison? Where is where are the indicators of poor success or poor outcomes from dual credit, alleged poor outcomes? I mean, is there a table where we could lay this out? And again, I understand there's different assumptions made by the different researchers, but we might be, someone commented earlier, it's not, the totality of the AIRS report indicates a positive thing. So we're spending, again, time discussing the differences in the researching method, the methodology, and perhaps if we just looked at the numbers, and we can find that all of the reports show a level of positive results, the degree of that might vary. But I haven't seen that summary. I mean, I've read the reports. I don't know that I read all 150 pages of their report, but I have not seen to date, and maybe the committee, the council has one. I haven't seen a summary document that really points to the differences in the results of the different groups' research.
And can I make a comment? I think as we're looking at all of this, we also need to remember the masses, the public. And there is so much dual credit that is being delivered in the state of Texas and across this country. And when people, they just need to hear the simple dual credit is good. Because those people, those parents, those students, those educators, they need to hear that. When you start talking about the research, I mean, that's important to all of us, and we need to spend time on that. But we need to, at some point, we need to funnel the message. And the message to the public is dual credit is good. Because we want to accomplish our goals. And our goals are really dependent on the 60 by 30, the dual credit, and what it's going to do for 60 by 30, what it's already done for closing the gaps. And if we create a message that this may not be a good thing, then we begin, I think, to regress in what we're trying to accomplish. And again, the public, they just need to hear a simple message. I'm not trying to say that they're simple, but we're all that way. We're all that way. We just need to know, is it good or not?
Can I ask John a question? I haven't seen the media reports today, but was there anything in the media reports from the hearing yesterday that pointed out that the commissioner felt that dual credit is a good thing? Because his report was a positive report, and he had some recommendations. They were fairly narrow, but I don't think they're all that different than some of the things coming out of the task force. Are not identical, but they're very similar. And I think part of the problem is, how can you make sure those things that don't sound controversial can get there? And that's something that maybe we need to work on together. How do we get that message out?
I mean, I haven't seen any media yet this morning, but I strongly agree with what you're saying, which is there has to be a broad message of dual credit has been and continues to be of benefit to students. That's clearly demonstrated. And then there has to be the follow-on message that there are specific areas where we can make it stronger. And I think that's, the challenge I know particularly our commissioner always has is with the legislature, making sure they have the big picture, but also that they have some sense of urgency in addressing what we need to address. And so, making sure that, I was struck in the hearing yesterday, one of the things that they were surprised to find in the Troutman study was that students coming in with up to 60 hours of dual credit still had the same amount of debt as students who just matriculated directly. And that our study and the Troutman study has shown that there's some time savings associated with dual credit, but it's not a tremendous amount, and that there's actually a semester credit hour gain. So those are important things to think about. What policy prescriptions can we adopt that are going to help address that? I know the task force had its recommendation in terms of having students declare meta majors or fields of study during high school. Our commissioners had a recommendation about putting a student on a degree plan in high school. So again, that's not bad-mouthing dual credit. That's recognizing a fact that it's not necessarily having the impact in some areas that the legislature would like it to.
Which is a common thought between at least the task forces. I think people recognize that. I mean, I believe that if a student takes dual credit, it's more rigorous, they're going to benefit. But they may not always benefit if they take a course that may not apply to their major from a efficiency standpoint in getting the degree. But it doesn't mean they didn't benefit in terms of the rigor of the course. But that's why one of the findings is if you may not get that degree in as timely a fashion as you might think if you were planning on majoring in geology and you don't typically have access to that. And those are things that a student just needs to know. It comes back to advising, and which in some ways is not much different than a student who starts at a school after high school. So some of these same things are problematic.
I think, Dr. Gardner, there's the long-term monetary benefit, and I think many studies play that out as being the case for dual credit. But in the short term, for the student expense, that's where we've got to look at what John just talked about. I think that all kind of gave us pause. So why is that? And I know he had certain theories, Troutman did, but looking into that would be important. You know, yesterday I have an 11th grader, and I just kind of played the role, and I thought, I'm going to call a certain university, and I know what she wants to get into. To get into a natural sciences degree, there's 3 different tracks for dual credit courses. Now, albeit I just did a cursory review of all the courses and there's overlap, but she doesn't know what she's going to be admitted to. So how is she to choose the right course? So it's very complicated, but I think talking to the four-year universities is very important in understanding those transfer, I don't want to call them commitments, but those transfer, at least somewhat of a promise, or what, it might be an assumption that students think when they take courses, are they definitely going to transfer to degree? And I know we've gone round and round with this, but that is critically, I mean, I think the elephant in the room sometimes is identifying, yes, these courses are dual credit, they're quote-unquote college credit, but where do they lead a student to? And we really need to, I think, really impress upon the powers that be that those courses transfer to degrees, and there's more transparency than exists now.
Well, and if you listen to the transfer hearing, there's some suggestions for that. I think,
Correct.
you know, the commissioner said one of our recommendations we've talked about before, but it was put forward that we have talk about developing 4 to 5 or 6 specialized cores that make it more clear that if you're going into, say, science and engineering, these are the decisions you should be making in the core. But a lot of what we're talking about here applies to everyone. I mean, I think most people know here that the average number of hours attempted for a baccalaureate degree, in the we made progress. We slipped from 140 to 139, but those are students who are paying for more than they need to wherever they start. Last we looked, it was 142 for dual credit students, but it's really the same issue. I don't know what it is this year, but part of it is making the right decisions at the right time and whether they count for the major. Because typically it will fit, but it may not for the major. And the reality is there are only so many dual credit courses that are really available, and most of them will count for virtually any major. But you can make a step that I think could lead you to taking more courses. And I think the task force recommendation is actually, as I recall, more restrictive than our recommendation, which I really like your recommendation.
Comment, Ron? Well, first comment is on the correlation between dual credit and ultimate student debt. That's not a one-on-one, obviously. If you look at the cost, the pure cost of taking dual credit at any community colleges versus the cost of taking the same course at any four-year institution, it's less. That's not even up for debate or discussion. Okay, so when you look at, I think, trying to tie dual credit and overall student debt is somewhat a leap because there's no direct correlation. There are too many variables in what decisions the student and that student's family make that incur that additional debt. And not to mention just what school do you go to? Do you go to A&M and Tech, go to Sam Houston, or do you go to SMU, TCU, and Rice? Okay, that has nothing to do with dual credit. And so I think there's just not even a topic there. Back on the comment of this board and the commissioner, we need to hear, I think our citizens need to hear, I think more importantly, legislature needs to hear the full support of dual credit. I think if anyone sees a kink in the armor, they're going to attack it. And I think dual credit is too important to the students of Texas for us to allow that to happen. And then the other topic I'll just touch on quick that Mr. Gardner talked about and Dr. Martinez about the transfer. That's a separate conversation from dual credit, certainly. But when we're talking about the possibility of students having an extra 6 hours, a lot of that has nothing to do with dual credit and has everything to do with what the four institutions will or will not accept from any community college. And at some point that has to be addressed. It's a different topic, it's a different conversation for another day and a separate issue, but it's got to be addressed or we're going to continue to have that problem. And again, it's separate from whether or not dual credit is or is not effective. That's not a relationship. So just want to throw those out.
Chairman, I would agree with Trustee Mims on both notes. An invitation. John, an invitation. If we can envision a joint press conference between this agency, TEA, just down the road, the leadership of TAC, that connotes three messages. Dual credit works in Texas. We aspire for managed growth, the growth of dual credit opportunities in an equitable way, as was called out by the task force report across the state, and continued improvements so we have a stronger and better product for our citizens. If we can focus on those three messages and have that be a joint message from the leadership of this for the state, an invitation. I think to your point about transferability, and forgive the analogy, if the bridge that we currently have in transfer does not have guardrails, and dual credit is the on-ramp that leads you to that bridge, then we don't start with the on-ramp. We start with the bridge. And what we learn, then come back and help make sure that on-ramp is working solidly. But I think you're absolutely right, Chairman.
Yeah, just a couple of comments about the thing about debt and so forth. I mean, first of all, keep in mind that the Troutman study only looked at UT students. So it didn't include A&M and other colleges. It only looked at UT students. Now among the UT schools, there are differences, of course, in tuition rates and that kind of thing. But his observation was that dual credit, that students with dual credit in the UT system had graduated with a level of debt that was almost as high as other UT students without dual credit. And he made no, and that was as far as it went. And he never really tried to say, and that's because of dual credit, which he didn't say at all. And he just made the observation that that was true, and that's what he found, and why would that be? And I think that is something that deserves some further look into, because it, as one of the senators pointed out, that seems to be rather counterintuitive, right? That, but I'm not so sure that it is, by the way, but that was one of the responses to it. So I do think it's one of those things that bears a greater look. And you're also correct, too, and I would quite agree that the issue of transfer and having excess hours is one issue, and the effectiveness of dual credit is another issue. And I would suspect that the excess hours that dual credit students amass over and above what students who without dual credit have may indeed, this is speculation on my part, but a lot of that may indeed have to do with the fact that dual credit offerings, as Dr. Gardner pointed out, can be somewhat limited sometimes. And don't forget that if you're a student trying to increase your GPA in high school, a dual credit class counts more than a regular high school class does. So for you, it may be very well worth taking a dual credit course that you may even know is not ever going to apply to a degree because it can do something for your GPA. So
Let me
that,
add
you know,
one
that may be
thing
part of the
about
picture.
the debt that, you know, we need to ask David Troutman about this because it is the UT schools. UT Austin is a significant player in terms of the number of students as a percent. It's not, but if you think about the students who go to UT Austin, they typically are coming from somewhere. They're, in many cases, probably going to have some debt that they might not have somewhere else because they're living away from home, so they're having to borrow money for those expenses. And so I think even though they're not going to totally drive the number, but I think that would affect the debt number. And if you look at our almanac, UT Austin doesn't include this, but we look at parental debt, and the parental debt that so they probably aren't including this, is about $15,000 for students who have debt in addition to the other debt. So I think this is one of these methodological things. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the study, but it may account for at least part of that financial, the debt issue, at least to some extent.
Right. And I would
Can we
just further
tie-
that.
Can we tie a ribbon around this and start talking about specific things? And I think the takeaway is everyone agrees that dual credit is good. There needs to be a better job in communicating that to the public through various means like that, and that the coordinating board and staff does not have to rely on only one study. You're able to take all the studies together, and if one of them is flawed in this area and one of them is flawed in that area, you don't have to, tie yourself to any one study. So I think we're all in agreement on that. I mean, is that a consensus?
Yes.
And so let's talk about some specific things, because, yeah, go ahead.
So maybe it's just me, but I think what would have been helpful for me is given, and I don't know if it's the meta-analysis that Rose refers to, but I think it's the messaging, is what is the broader message about this? That's no doubt. But then within that, there are policy prescriptions, trying to use your phrase. What are the things out of all that the Higher Ed Coordinating Board is going to take to the legislature? These are the positions we're going to take and recommend. What are the institutional implications that maybe agency, community colleges, 4 years, these are the things that the institutions need to work through. They've been identified, but we don't necessarily need the legislature to get into those things, but we're going to take them. And what are the things that still need further research, that these issues have been identified, but we don't need the legislature jumping into those yet until we actually do more research. And then present that, at least to me, because if you got the coordinating board meeting next month, it'd be interesting to get the feedback of this group to me to say, this is what we anticipate our message and our takeaway from all that being what we're going to present, and then we got to figure out how to message that to the public, to the legislators, to others. So I'm still not sure what's going to go to the coordinating board out of all that, but it seems like you have this body together from a community and technical college perspective that might be helpful to say, this is what we think our takeaway is from all of that, rather than just the AR study, and what do y'all think about that? Does that seem like it aligns? And so, at least for me, it's a lot of discussion. You can look at studies, there's good and bad, there's lots of analysis. We can poke holes at the process or the people. But at the end of the day, I think the study was done for the coordinating board. What is the takeaway that y'all have with all the other factors, the task force, the multiple studies, the hearings you've heard, the feedback you've got, and what does all that mean? And what is the position y'all are going to take internally into the legislature? And then are there, like I say, things that we as institutions need to go do before we get the legislature jumping in and trying to solve a problem? And if there's some way to actually say when they try to get in there, don't go there yet. We've got some additional research, or the institution's going to take care of it. And then, like I say, the benefit of this group would be to give you the feedback on that before you take it to the full board, in my perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's when I said, let's get down to talking about specifics, policies, what's going to be doing. Yes.
John made a comment a little earlier about the state is reaping 5 times the benefit of dual credit. Could you expound on that a little bit?
I may actually have to defer to Rex. It was a finding of our cost study. I'm sorry, AIR study.
Yeah, and to try to simplify it as much as I can, when it looks at things like what is the economic benefit of having a college degree or a certificate of some kind? What does that do in terms of increased wages over a lifetime? What does that do to reduced need for the state in terms of welfare or health care and so forth? And a lot of this is tied back to the social and economic and sometimes purely physical benefits that accrue from having a college education. And some of that is just because you get, you move up the economic ladder, you can afford better health care, so you get it. And it covers the gamut of things from keeping people out of prison and so forth, and having them pay taxes rather than drawing tax money and that kind of thing. And so in that total context of what are the benefits of dual credit students and where they wind up, then that's sort of where that 5.5 times the cost. And, and we know that already with, I think it's been pretty well demonstrated over and over again that having a college degree or a college credential of some kind leads to much better outcomes across the board as a general rule. And I think that what dual credit does is contribute to that as well.
Unfortunately, that comment was that statement was made yesterday, and there was no further discussion. Nobody picked up on it. Would have been helpful had someone asked a question like you just did, and lacking that, if it had been followed up on, giving some of the more detail that Rex just gave. So again, it's a problem of messaging. Even when you get it out there, do you get it out there enough so that people are hearing it? But that's a very positive statement. And
that is a very positive statement. One of the
I'm afraid as we move into the legislative process, which is just around the corner, if we allow discussions about these reports to be what we talk about, we're going to be in the weeds just like we are right now. And I've heard several very positive things presented today, and I hope that in the end you'll accept Jacob's invitation to come out and put a statement together that says, this is our takeaway. And fair or not fair, that report in the public eye seems to belong to the coordinating board. And so I think it's very important that you say, this is our takeaway. Well, and there's so many positive things from it that I think that can be done very, 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 very well.
I suggest,
you'll,
I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
We have made, as I said, this commitment to a major policy issue where we wanted to get all of these out together to make sure, because our board hasn't heard all of these either. So I just, there's been that commitment for 6 weeks now to do that because we think it's important and to have some of these discussions. And frankly, because of the things that have happened since then, I think that will be an even better major policy issue than it would have been before. But we don't know how our board will react to various things. But they will be presented a full picture. We think it's important. We've always felt it's important to have all the perspectives out there, at least the various, the task forces and the studies that we're aware of recently. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, Mr. Chairman, in an effort to put a bow on it, if the committee is seeking an action, the way I see it is this whole dual credit discussion would be a wonkish, detailed kind of debate that would go on in the back rooms of, policy preparation. If it hadn't been for the fact that one angle on the matter made the press, and the urgency is that the group feels, I think, is that the press has put out a position on it that appears to be derogatory to the main current on that. So the real reaction that has any urgency is the public reaction, like Jacob is suggesting. That's what has some urgency. The rest of the policy discussion could occur in its time, in its place, which is in discussions like this and with legislators, both en masse and privately. The real concern is how will the legislature react to this public statement. So it seems to me that Jacob's invitation for the agencies to enter into a good faith dialogue seeking a public position that has commonalities and appears to reflect this main current that we're hearing here is probably something this committee could recommend. So if you're looking for an action item, that might be something for us to consider in terms of what we do here. We won't settle anything, but we do have the authority to make recommendations, which is a big part of our purpose.
Well, and I'm wondering if, as we take a look at the data, I think we can all agree that in order for us to say that data is valid, that it's reliable, is whether or not it can be replicated. And maybe this is just a point, a starting point. And maybe some of the message that needs to be put forward is that there needs to be ongoing study. And we need to continue to look at, yes, these general themes that have come out of the data. But I think that I can speak for my colleagues in the fact that we are all fairly good at institutional effectiveness. And I think that we can take a look at some of those general themes that we're taking a look at. But I'm really concerned, as one of those rural institutions that Jacob referenced, that we're going to end up with a one-size-fits-all approach in policy. And that really begins to bother me because I know that we are not all alike. And I think even if we took a look at the things that separate us as institutions, you start to begin to figure out where some of this is coming from. You start to begin to realize, for example, that if you're looking at an area of the state, such as the area that Kilgore College serves, not all of the high schools are actually able to pay for their students to take dual credit courses. Some are, some are not. So that begins to present a difference there in a way that we approach then the data that comes from that difference.
I'll plead ignorance. I've not read our bylaws, but I think do we have a consensus that they follow through on a suggestion made that we're suggesting that these groups get together and issue a statement? That kind of consensus, and then statement in support of what we're talking about. And to kind of follow up on what Mark was saying, and I'm using word specifics, but okay, we're talking. Is there an area of policy that is going to lead to recommendations to the legislature that are formalized, ready to talk about? There may be some that are not, but we'd kind of like to know what recommendations. I know TAC and CAT have a few, and it was very helpful to hear those. But what's going on with policy and potential legislation that we can get involved in?
And I can answer a couple of things. So as you know, our board adopted its legislative recommendations several months ago and adopted 2 recommendations basically regarding dual credit with basically the caveat pending the outcomes of the AIR study and various other studies. And those recommendations were, as I mentioned earlier, that students in dual credit would file a degree plan at 30 semester credit hours. So essentially taking the current requirement on campus and pushing it down into dual credit so that, and the goal with that was, as I mentioned, ensuring that students are taking dual credit thoughtfully and that they're taking courses in a manner that is going to lead them toward a specific certificate or degree. So that was one of the recommendations that we had adopted. The other recommendation was that students in dual credit demonstrate college readiness through either the TSIA, the SAT, or the ACT. So as you know, currently there are ways to be dual credit eligible without necessarily demonstrating college readiness. And so the concern that our commissioner had was that are students who are not college ready able to fully benefit from dual credit? And I believe the draft AIR study shows that students who are academically underprepared do not benefit, certainly not as much as those who are. So our recommendation was to have that requirement, but also recognizing that those tests have fees associated with them, working with the legislature to identify a last dollar approach to ensure that students who need assistance in being able to take those exams have it available to them. So those are the two that we have on the table right now. Those are always subject to modification up to, and in fact, through the legislative session.
Any comments related to those?
Question, so just clarification, on the 30 hours, are you saying 30 hours of dual credit in a high school? They file a degree plan, just make sure I
Yes.
understand. And who do they file it with, and does that apply also to early college high schools, PTECs, all of the, the cluster ICAs? Is that a universal application on who's
Well,
gonna
it would be
file
filing
to do
with the community college or I guess university offering the dual credit. And essentially, we would simply take the current requirement that says that at 30 hours on campus, you have to file a degree plan and simply include dual credit hours in that requirement. So that students who take their 30 hours at high school just as if they'd been on campus. So I don't believe it would necessarily apply to early college.
Well, if you look at the blueprint that TEA has established for early college high schools, in this sense, I use early college high school in the broad umbrella that would include the traditional early college high school, PTEC academies, the ICAs, and so forth. But anyone that has that model, they're required to advise and be on a degree plan from the beginning.
Okay. And second, just on the college ratings, I thought there was some discussion at one point about, does that apply to CTE courses as well as the more pure academic courses?
I should clarify, that is for academic dual credit. The thing I get bashed for all the time and I need to be more mindful of is clarifying the distinctions between academic and career and technical dual credit.
So just one quick caveat to that. Bear in mind that even in CTE, once you get to a level 2 certificate or an associate of applied science degree, then you're TSI liable at that point. But for level 1 certificates, you're not.
So will students need to start taking the TSIA before they enroll in dual credit? Am I understanding that correctly?
That would be our recommendation.
Okay. Makes sense. How does that affect sophomores or rising sophomores that may be going into dual credit?
Well, my understanding is that the TSIA is available to anyone.
Okay.
So, obviously SAT, ACT may be more difficult, but the TSIA is there as an instrument for them to demonstrate college readiness.
Okay. Fun fact for show and tell, Waco ISD started class on August 21st, and that was the night we had our summer commencement. And a rising senior went to school her first day and got her associate degree that night. By far the exception rather than the rule, but it was quite the stunner.
Just one quick question for John, and far-fetched for the fellow who's losing his hair to try to split a hair, but I need to split a hair. Requiring a student to take TSIA, absolutely. Requiring a student to be TSIA complete, that's my question. So, perfect.
I'll defer to the expert here.
No, it would require them to be, just as with any regular college student, they need to be TSI complete in the area they're going to go into. And we usually break that down between reading and writing intensive or math intensive.
Perfect.
So, yeah, it would apply to the requisite areas.
So then, thank you. It's an important distinction. Because so I think, Chairman, with regards to your question, it seems to me that we have two, I thought I read three yesterday, but two recommendations that are already on the books from the coordinating board, possibly more at the October meeting. There is a set of recommendations that were put forth by the statewide task force, And to be clear, some of those are for practitioners, not necessarily for state policy. And then the set of recommendations that are put forth by TAC and CAT. I don't know that we have the time today to do a sort of a table of that, but to the extent that there is some throughputs that already exist, the advising at 30 hours, we're recommending actually at 12 hours, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there's some areas there where we can almost already agree on some of those and then figure out the differences at 30, or is it 15, or is it 12, et cetera. And then there are some new areas that are not yet at the coordinating board's plate that I would love to have a conversation to see whether or not we can get the coordinating board to, either now or at the October meeting or at the January meeting, to actually agree to the recommendation. And I'll be very, very clear. The one that comes to my mind is a recommendation for a need-based grant program to help students pay for the dual credit course.
Okay. Let me, since you bring up that one, I was going to say something about, our own concern with that alone is that it not be to the detriment of funding for Texas Grant or TEOG, or, you know, that, and the way it's stated, that isn't clear. I think you believe that, but we can't take away from one pot, and there may be other variations of how one could do that, but we have that concern. But one thing we had thought, and I'm glad you brought up the recommendations, in terms of several of you that it would be on the major policy issue ahead of time, is it might be an opportunity to sit down and say, what are the recommendations? And maybe part of what we have, and we have to work this out, is have a table at the end and say, here's the different recommendations. We have no idea what the recommendations are for AIR, but just put those straight out for the board. Because part of a major policy issue, for those of you who don't know, is an opportunity for the board to hear something in much more detail and ask a lot of questions. And frankly, we tend to limit the presenters to a fairly small amount of time, but usually 10 minutes, but they may be asked questions and respond to questions for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, depending on what's going on. So there is that opportunity built into what we're doing. And as I said, we don't know what AIRs are. We do know the task force. We know tax, very similar but not identical. And we do believe those should be on the table.
And before we move forward, I want to go back and kind of comment on Jacob and to John's point about the advisement piece. Given that an associate's degree is only 60 hours, I really think it's counterproductive to have a recommendation on the table for 30 hours. Because at that point, particularly on the technical side, since a large portion of those technical associate's degrees are 30 hours is essentially part of the largest chunk of that curriculum. So I would strongly recommend, as opposed to 12 hours, that it be 15 hours. And secondly, as it relates to the cost, and it was mentioned earlier about particularly in rural areas, a lot of the ISDs can't afford to pay. And as you're aware, from either from a policy, well, from a policy perspective, with early college, high school, specifically, the community colleges or the two-year colleges can't charge the student, unlike with dual credit. So it is really cumbersome. And I made this point yesterday, either from a scalability or a sustainability issue, as we talk about growth, it's really going to become problematic moving forward.
There was one specific thing that Jacob mentioned, and that's having support for a need-based support. Does anyone have any qualms with that at all? Subject to, we don't want to, cut off one arm for the sake of the other. So that's something we can all live with. I'm talking too much, but there's one thing in this airport that really I have a question about. It's on page 171, where he said, we find no evidence suggesting that student access to dual credit programs where fee waivers played a role in narrowing the disparities. And I find that hard to believe, that if we are able to fund dual credit for the, I think the word was underprivileged, that it's not going to result in these underprivileged students performing well in dual credit. So check page 171. And one little plug, Brenda, you're right. I mean, our colleges do a lot of tracing. And we originally, this is Victoria College, we did not pay tuition for the students in 2016. Zero economic disadvantage were in the dual credit. We found that was not good. So what we had to do, because we're like Rex and Brenda, we can't afford just to waive that. So we got together with the college foundation and the school foundation, the ISD foundation, and they provided scholarships for those people. This is just one college. The next year, there were 6 and 9, 16 and 21, and this year, they're 30 and 25. Now, that 30 represents 34% of the people enrolled in dual credit are economically disadvantaged. And in the other one, the other high school, it's 20%. So I think there's great merit in providing aid for the economic disadvantage to be involved in dual credit. There was some criticism, again in this report, that somehow dual credit isn't affecting the economic disadvantage. Well, this has to be common sense would say that, this is a factor. So, I think we all wholeheartedly applaud TAC and CAT's recommendation that we get economically disadvantaged into dual credit. And that's one of the reasons we have it. So anyway, sorry for my preaching, but I do think it's important that we have these kids in dual credit, and if they can't afford it, they can't.
I hate to point out again, but the coordinating board in 60 by 30 has specifically addressed economically disadvantaged students having access to dual credit is important. So, and that, we made that statement when we adopted that in 3 years ago. So I just want to say that we agree with that. We already are pursuing that.
So I think you can then join TAC and CAT in supporting that legislation, because that's the only way you're going to get it done. Yes, ma'am.
I sat on a dual credit task force at TAC for 2 years, and the one thing that came out of that is that we know how different we are, all of the institutions, rural, mid-size, big systems. And so I think the thing that I got out of that is that we don't tell our story very well. People remember stories and they remember things. We don't tell enough stories about dual credit students and how they've gone on. They're the first in the family, first generation to get a degree. In the old days, we all came together and did a statewide commercial about community colleges, and some of you old-timers will remember that. It was phenomenal because it just showed the strength of us as a unit. And maybe that's the approach we need to take instead of focusing so much on a lot of the negativity of these reports. What is it that we're doing well? How are we alike? What is that one message? Because those are stories, and that, I think, is a selling point. So I just wanted to make mention of that. We got to remember that, and that's the strength in us being united, is that we are putting people to work. What is it, 20,000 new dual credit students this past year. Anyway, I won't rant.
Well, are there any other specific legislative items that TAC and CAT are supporting right now?
So there are several. We would, this goes along the lines of the declaring a major or 30 hours. Ours would be that you declare a meta major or a field study much earlier. And I think Dr. Howard's offer of compromise makes a lot of sense to us. But frankly, for us, 12 semester credit hours it's a pretty early juncture. But I think the last data set that I saw from the coordinating board says that most students graduate with about 15 semester credit hours on average. And so Obviously, we want to make sure we get them before they leave the campuses. And then we also tied that 12 semester credit hours, we tied that to the number of hours that the student would be eligible for that need-based grant. So it would not be eligibility for the entire dual credit experience, but be for the first 12 hours, to try to bring at least some level of equitable access to it, at least for the first 12 hours. So that's how that came to be. If I could, on the need-based aid, because I think if we can, God knows if we can find consensus, that would be a good place. There's a time-honored philosophy with regard to how students pay for college. That's sort of one third or so, one piece is the federal government provides support through support to institutions and certainly support to students. At the federal level, we all know that the federal Pell Grant program is a substantial investment. And in Texas, the federal government invests just short of $1 billion in Pell Grants for community college students just alone. And then certainly, while there's variance among the states in the past have traditionally supported through formula funding to institutions, and then of course in some cases, I would call out Illinois and California specifically, have really for decades made major investments in need-based student financial aid for students. And then there's been this understanding that families have sort of some piece of it. This is why federal needs analysis, and this is really into the weeds, but this is why federal needs analysis has something called the expected family contribution. So there's an expectation that the family takes place. Our recommendation honors that. What is new and perhaps pioneering is that we are now taking it a little earlier. We are not waiting for students to be 18 years old and therefore eligible for TEOG and eligible for Pell Grants. What we're saying is for some students, let's bring it down earlier so they are eligible for that. It is a statutory change. Specifically to the TAC recommendation, it would be to amend TEOG. So this would be not a new grant program, but to amend TEOG and allow that. That seems, in my mind, consistent with the philosophy of dual credit. What we're doing with dual credit, and I'm using the royal we here, what we're doing with dual credit is we're bringing that college experience earlier in the years for students. This is consistent with that. And then to Dr. Gardner's good caution, absolutely. This would not be at the expense of existing programs. This would not be expense of Peter to pay for Paul. We had John, I'll bring you up to speed on the next briefing. The UT system and TACC briefed staffers, House and Senate staffers on the relevant committees, and had a very deep conversation on this recommendation. And that's exactly how we led, and that's exactly what I concluded. Please consider this recommendation, but do not consider it at the expense of others. It is one of the reasons why we chose not to make a recommendation for formula funding, either for community colleges or for school districts. It is one of the reasons why we decided not to sort of dip into that pot, because in that case, it is a lot easier than to say, okay, fine, we're going to put that in there, but we're going to take one to the other. So with that, Chairman, I mean, there are other recommendations that I think are fitting, but I think those would be the ones that I would call out.
One of the issues also in the AIRS report is counseling. And listening to the committee meeting yesterday, it would get the impression that certified may not be the right word, but that some of the counselors might need some sort of training beforehand. And I think it goes back to what we've all said. Each community college probably needs to make their decision on how best counseling would work in their area. No problem with having qualified, certified counselors, but leave it there, and don't dictate, what their work should be. Does anyone have a comment on any of that? Because that is part of the report, and ones where we probably need to improve. The royal way.
The only comment I'll make, I think all of us at the community college level certainly if we're working in the pathways projects, we've already recognized the need for better, more frequent, earlier, and improved counseling, advising for all of our students. And I think we're already working on that. So I think we're, in general, supportive of the idea that we need to be improving in that area. I don't know we need the state dictating the specifics of that for sure, but I think we all recognize that's something that's very important to the success of our students, reducing the additional hours that a student might graduate with, and therefore the cost to the student. And so from a student success, student benefit standpoint, I think we're all on board to support that. So, but again, just don't need the state telling us every little detail of it.
But I do think that what's helpful about some of that discussion, though, is that it helps the legislature realize just how costly good advising can be, and that there may be some aids to that, if you will, like a statewide advising system that things like OnCourse is working on, that we've discussed internally a great deal, that would help advisors. And so I think part of it is also letting them know that if you really want to solve the advising problem, part of that means that there needs to be some more money put into this somewhere. And so, so I think that's the helpful part of it, not asking them to specify what it is that an advisor ought to be doing every day, but helping with the cost of it. And because, I mean, everybody, you all face the constraints of, you all know you need more advisors, but not everybody's got a whole lot of extra money sitting around to just go hire a bunch more advisors, and to train them as well. And so part of our efforts are directed at looking at these things that may be applicable at a statewide level, though, that would also, but then be helpful to advisors on the other end in terms of information, the kind of information that they can get to students and that sort of thing. So I think there is something helpful about discussing it without getting into we need a statute that tells everybody what to do about it.
Let the record show that I completely agree with Dr. Peebles.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to pile on what Rex said, because I think you'll find that across the state of Texas, all 50 of our community colleges are uniquely different, simply from the reason of how they get funds. Our particular database, we have Fort Hood, which is the largest installation in the state of Texas, and we don't get to tax one dime of the buildings and the facilities that are there. That makes it kind of difficult, given the geographic restrictions of the way the legislature set up the taxing entities. So we've got 3 little communities that we get to tax. Then they came along and said, well, not only will you tax those units, but we're going to exempt all the soldiers who have retired that have 100% disability. You're not going to be able to tax their personal property. And then they came back and said, well, with the Hazelwood Act, we're going to let students of military members transfer their entitlements for their GI Bill, Montgomery Bill education to their dependents. And oh, by the way, since we're doing that, you can't charge the dependent any tuition. But we're not going to reimburse you either, because the Hazelwood Act doesn't have any funds attached to it. It's an unfunded mandate. So, you look around and say, well, how are we doing this dual credit? And well, if the high school student, if KISD doesn't pay for them, then what we have to do is offer them a scholarship, or we pay it ourselves. And there's something inherently wrong with that system throughout the entire state of Texas. We don't have one area that could be translated as one size fits all for all the community colleges. They're all different. And you could divide up the state of Texas and say, okay, you've got this many counties to tax, and you've got this many counties to tax, or whatever, but they haven't done that. We get a lot of students from Lampasas County, and they don't pay one dime in taxes. So these kind of things play directly on how effective you're going to come up with dual credit. If it can't afford to pay for it, then they won't take it. And most families say, well, we're supposed to get free high school education, free public school education, so why am I paying for this? So the whole thing, it gets clouded all the way across simply because of the funding. And then we look at these studies, and my takeaway from the studies that the University of Texas put out was, oh, by the way, we want more money. We don't want to give you credit for the college work you took because we can sell you that same class and we can get tuition off of you. That may be jaundice on my part since it came from the University of Texas, but I believe that's part of the problem is everybody looks at the bottom line for the dollar and we're all fighting for the same piece of money. I think that has to be addressed with the legislature. The legislature's got to pull something out of the rabbit and say, look, we're either going to have this thing and we're going to do it so that it benefits the citizens, or we can't. But the unfunded mandate's just eating us alive. That's my comment.
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm not, this kind of goes back to what Rex was saying about some kind of statewide model with advising. I'm the past chair of the North Texas Community College Consortium, and over the last 5 or 6 years, we've developed a template to where we're aligning dual credit courses with our community college courses with university courses. We started in the technical field and then we've now moved it into the academic field and are beginning to align marketable skills with industries. So the great thing about it is that we're now getting high school counselors in with our advisors, in with university advisors, all in the same room talking, sharing this model, and so a student can now go online, click on the school they want to attend, click on the community college, the university, and the advising is there. I mean, it's the degree plan in hand. And I think our president of our organization came down maybe and presented at the coordinating board. I think she did. But we may have to look at something like that on the advising end. It still keeps us unique. All of the community colleges having their own unique individual advising model, but having something in place in a statewide model that will bring us all together to be able to work together and have better advising for students. Just wanted to throw that in.
I would like to follow up on that comment regarding the advising. The fastest growing population, the minorities, especially the Hispanic population, and we are leaving out that factor that there's an issue there on the understanding of the dual credit programs. Just as the example that Ms. Rose Martinez gave, that's one of many examples that demonstrate that this is complex. This is very difficult to comprehend, this system. And especially with the first generation immigrants and with Hispanics, and on top of that, a language barrier, we have an issue there. And as Rex Pebbles put there, mentioned, we need additional funding, at least in the populations where there's a big growth, which is, I think, in the majority of the 50 community colleges, the Hispanic population. And that is one area, in addition to just the general, just minorities, that we need to put more emphasis to understand this. In our example in Laredo, when we're growing exponentially the dual credit, and it's bringing upon, as I mentioned earlier this year when we had this discussion, other sets of problems with it. And we've grown from 1,500 now to almost 4,000 students in a matter of just 2 years. And I see that growing even more. But the problems are the population in the high school, the advisors in the high school are certainly not prepared to understand the complexities of the programs that the colleges bring. The pathways, just like Ms. Martinez mentioned, all the different options. And that brings another set of issues and challenges that we need to keep aware if we want to succeed. And obviously, we all agree the dual credit is a great thing, but it needs improvement, and especially in the area of advising. We need additional funding, at least in the areas where there's a lot higher minority disadvantage, Hispanic population. And in addition to that, the language exacerbates that. And we need to keep that in mind for this to continue to be successful. All right, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Chairman, if I might, this great conversation on funding reminds me that we're presenting to the Board of Reviews on the LAR, so if you'll forgive me, I think I should step away. Get ready for that.
I think
That's pretty important.
I'll join in thanking you for coming. Rose, are you staying or are you going also?
I should probably advise the chair.
So we're jointly presenting both categories.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I was just going to say goodbye.
Forgive our absence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, kind of following up on what Rex was saying, and it kind of dovetails into Mark, I mean, is there an appetite for the legislature to look at funding, good, bad, or indifferent? And I'm talking about overall funding of.
Well, I mean, funding is never an easy sell. If you look at the current budget environment, we're in a pretty good situation as a state. My understanding from the latest comptroller reports is that, you know, the tax revenue is coming in. I know that there are some liabilities the state's incurred that they're going to have to address. But, I mean, it's not the best situation we've been in, and it's certainly not the worst situation we've ever been in. So I think we can have those conversations, but, you know, it's always, you know, if the legislature is going to make an investment, they need to know what they're getting out of it. And so I think pretty crucial to any conversation about increasing funding, whether it be this proposed grant program, whether it be increases to formula funding, is going to be demonstrating, you know, this is what you can expect out of your institutions if you're willing to make this investment. And I can tell you in terms of funding, you know, a big focus of ours is going to be our formula funding recommendations for the next cycle, getting a little bit off topic. But we're very focused on ensuring that our institutions, 2-year and 4-year, have the resources through that mechanism to ensure that they're able to serve their students.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, if the data shows that there's a 5-to-1 return, is that the number? Right.
5 times.
Those tax revenues that are coming in because, in part, of the dual credit programs without which we can't succeed at 60 by 30. So I think we could make at least a cogent argument that the funding that we're asking for is creating the tax revenues that the state is enjoying.
And I do think that's one of the strongest arguments. Yep.
And can I add to the conversation when we're talking about funding? Rex, you brought up something about funding in the rural areas, Pam. You know, when we try to do CTE and we want to increase what we're doing in CTE, let me just remind everyone that when you're trying to deliver CTE out into those 1A and 2A schools, it's difficult because you have small numbers, but yet you want to bring that opportunity to those young people. And so I'd like to get that on the table, the CTE cost in the rural areas and the need to be able to address that. Because in many situations, that's really what those students need is CTE because of what they're going to be doing.
I'm probably not going to say this accurately, but I thought I read this week that Morath and the TEA came up with their funding request and that the actual state share was going to go down in the billions because of the increase in property taxes and the way school districts are funded. And because they've got the school funding formulas, which haven't changed yet, they may choose to put more money in. Mike wasn't able to say, I need more money, because the formulas dictate how much money it's there. But if all that happens, then there's less money in education. It feels like dual credit is this tweener between K-12 and higher ed. And if a case can be made between the two agencies to talk about, before you automatically assume that $5 billion or whatever that number is goes back into the general fund, but can we make it an investment in particularly if it stays in education and bridges the gap between the two, so that working with TA Commissioner, or Ed Board and say that this is money that the state's already committed to education the prior session. Let's keep it there, but we may change the direction a little bit of how it's used and fund some of these things that are gaps across the state that have a 5-to-1 return.
So just to piggyback and clarify, and this is a thought that I've had and something I'm working with our in my region and with our local ISD. Are you saying in essence, if I'm correct, since if you look at the number of dual credit students, it does represent a significant savings to the ISDs in terms of their teacher cost. So is that what you're suggesting, that those revenues be redirected to higher ed?
I'm not sure I know the answer of how it's packaged in the case, but I'm saying there's dollars that are invested in education today by the state that, under the current finance formulas, and I've got a school finance commission looking at it, are being freed up because the increase in property taxes across the state, and they're projecting, I think, 6 or 7% a year for the next couple of years. Where does that money go that was invested in education by the state? And I'm saying keep it in education somewhere, and then maybe these are the cases that get made about where you put it that may be a little different than the school funding formulas, but some of it may be higher ed, some may be community college, if the payback is there. So I don't know where it's going to go, but it seemed like that money was money if I'm a legislator, I'm thinking, okay, now that frees up other money. I don't have to put as much money in health care because I'm going to have money coming in from education. One of the big, there was a study done this summer, a group called TGAC, that was saying keep education dollars in education, but when you have increases in property taxes, don't make that reduce the state's share. And if they've already got that level of commitment, keep it in education somewhere. Let's just figure out the right place to put it, which may be part of the case made, but it's lots of arguments I think that have already been described here, and there's probably others about where it can potentially be used more effectively.
I think that to Dr. Howard's point is there's a cost shifting. We have to pay for adjuncts, and we work with one of the largest school districts in the state, and at least in the current agreement, they require us to pay the district what we would be paying the adjunct. It's not going to the adjunct. And this was, in the coming year, we're going to negotiate out of that, but I don't think the adjunct cost is going to go away. And they're receiving state funds for that teacher. And then we're having to pay the adjunct. So the ISD, this is aside from a tax issue. This is, there is some cost shifting, and the benefit, if we focus on the benefit to the student and the state, we shouldn't be paying, reimbursing the district for costs that it is already being reimbursed for or being compensated for through state or local taxes.
By the way, very eloquently said. That was my point exactly.
Were there any things that came up yesterday with regard to the Senate committees thinking they were double funding? I know a few years ago when they realized how much remedial education was going on, they wondered why they were having to fund that. And I was just a little fearful. I'm a little afraid of opening Pandora's box, and was just wondering how that went yesterday.
You know, Rex, I don't recall much conversation at all about funding.
If I recall correctly, there was very little discussion about funding, and you're right, that a few years ago there was some concern about double dipping, but LBB did a study on this before the last legislative session, I think, and they essentially arrived at the conclusion that, and the double dipping came from the fact that the high school's getting average daily attendance funding for the course. The college is getting contact hour reimbursement for the course if it's a dual credit course. And the LBB essentially concluded that really it was a question of, and this is not entirely true, but by the way, but to the extent that dual credit actually helps increase your enrollment, this would not be true. But on the other hand, their argument was that it's really a question of, do we pay it now or do we pay it later? In other words, we're going to pay for the high school course sometime, and we're probably going to pay for the college course sometime. And so we can either pay for the high school course now and the college course later, or we can pay for both of them at the same time, but we're still going to pay for them, one way or the other. And once they came out with that, then a lot of the discussion about that sort of went away, and there was, I think LBB made some mention of this yesterday, but that was it, and there was no discussion of that yesterday at all. But I do think, and I do think that over the long run, that one of the most, or I think what could be one of the most important parts of the AIR study is really the cost study part of it. Because it really does begin to really point out the differences between academic dual credit, funding CTE. And you know, and I know, and you know, and this doesn't get talked about very often, but the reality is that community colleges have used academic transfer programs to pay for CTE for years and years and years. I mean, that's how stuff gets funded, let's face it. And so, and that's not a bad thing, but that's how it works. But if you wind up in the position where you have to give more and more of your academic dual credit or your academic course away in academic dual credit, and you're not getting that tuition and fees from that source, that decreases your amount of money that you can fund for CTE over here. So there are funding implications of this that go beyond just how do we fund dual credit. It's how do we also fund the kind of CTE that we need going forward to reach 60 by 30 and keep the economy of Texas going and so forth. So I think that part of it is something that people really ought to take a much closer look at and really tease out some of the implications of that. And as far as policy going forward, you know, that's a place where I think the state can and should play a role. And it's tied up in all kinds of issues. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with your chancellor about some of these issues, about particularly the exemptions for military disabled. Well, but if you're in a place where a lot of those folks retire to, that has an impact on you that no other place in the state's going to feel to any great extent. So I think there's a lot of issues around funding that need to be addressed.
Does it look like we have a champion in the legislature, or would they need to be addressed? How are they going to be addressed? Are y'all going to have some sort of program that you suggest to some of those champions?
Well, I mean, part of it's going to be who's holding what chairs. So I think it's reasonable in the Senate. We pretty much know who the cast of characters are going to be. It's very likely that Senator Nelson will be back as finance chair. You know, we'll hopefully Senator Seliger will be back as higher ed chair and Taylor as public ed. On the House, it's a very different scenario. I believe we're up to 5 potential speakers that have declared. And whoever comes out as speaker, you know, that's going to determine who the chairs are going to be of the relevant committees. So it's much tougher to know who to target over on the House side. That being said, we're in communication with, you know, those legislators that we know are interested in these issues. So, you know, we're briefing Senate offices, House offices. Well, actually, so we'll be down in Kingsville next week to present to House Higher Ed regarding dual credit. So, but we're not really going to know until the session arrives who specifically are going to be in the position to really influence those decisions about funding.
Well, the funding that Rex was talking about, is that going to be a goal or of the coordinating board?
Well, we adopted our formula funding recommendations. So, you know, our goal, and we will pursue this rigorously, is to ensure that funding for the sector is increased, that it is increased to reflect inflation, that it is increased to reflect enrollment growth, but also very important for our commissioner and our board is that it is increased to reflect student success. So our recommendation is to get that student success point funding up to $215 per point. Our recommendation for the technical colleges is to get the return value formula back to the 35%. So that's going to be our focus in terms of funding for the legislature. Kind of separately from that, there's also our own agency and our funding. We had our hearing with the LBB in the governor's office last week on our LAR, and you have a handout with some of our exceptional item requests, well, all of our exceptional item requests. So we are requesting some additional administrative funding as well as some programmatic funding. Just a couple of items I wanted to make sure to point out is that we are requesting additional funding for fields of study so that we can help pay for some of those transportation costs associated with faculty from 2-year and 4-year institutions participating in the fields of study. The legislature was very clear that they wanted us to have those top 25 transfer majors fields of study in place, and I think we're on a track to do that.
We are. There are, of course, we've run into some snags with some, as you can imagine, some disciplines are more difficult to bring together than other disciplines are. We've gone to a sort of half-day and half-day format on this, and we've discovered that if you give them the afternoon to get all of their academic freedom concerns, and my institution does it better than any other institution does, and that comes from both the 2-year and the 4-year sector, by the way. If you give them the afternoon to get all that angst out of the way, then they can usually devote the next morning to actually coming up with the courses that students need to have at the lower division level. And so we've been pretty successful at that, I think. So we will either hit the 25 or be very, very close to it by the time we get to January. There are some, we do run into sort of unexpected things every once in a while. We just finished up the communications field of study, for example. But they on their own, whereas before they had addressed marketing and advertising, they decided on their own that needed to be a completely different field of study with a completely different committee, and did not want to touch that aspect of it. But we did get communications and journalism and sort of mass media out of it, though. So, but we're making good progress.
A couple other, I might just quickly note a couple other quick items to make you aware of. So we had a couple of other exceptional item requests, $1.3 million for our 60 by 30 TX regional strategies. As you're well aware, we are working regionally with institutions, with employers, with the public ed sector to come up with innovative kind of region-specific strategies for meeting our 60 by 30 goals. And so we're requesting money from the legislature to have a grant process whereby we can make awards to the regions to help support implementing those innovative strategies. And then we also have a request for $1 million for TSIA modernization. So this funding would go toward modernizing the exam, make sure that it continues to be relevant. There have been some concerns addressed regarding the transportability of the results, regarding integrating reading and writing in the exam, as well as simply making sure that the standards continue to be justified. So we have $1 million request that would support that work. And then, I'm sorry, do you have a... Oh. On the other side of it, so as part of our LAR, we also have to, and we're required by the LBB to propose, if you had to take a 10% reduction, where would you take that funding? And so we came up with that scenario, and the overriding emphasis in coming up with that was protecting those programs that most directly contribute to student access and success in higher education. So we tried to hold off on any proposed cut to our financial aid programs as much as possible, but financial aid is over 3/4 of our budget. So we were forced to put some potential cuts on the table for that. I don't have any indication that the legislature intends to take those cuts. It's just something that we're required to do as part of this scenario. So we had that hearing last week. The next time we find out what will actually happen with our budget will be when those bills are first introduced. And that's usually pretty early in the session those will be released.
Do you have any other comments on legislative updates or interim?
That's what
discussion?
y'all stole a lot of my thunder going straight to dual credit. But that's what I have.
Does anyone else have any questions, comments, generally on dual credit? We have 13 minutes. We can either ask Gary what, in the long agenda we have, is there one topic we need to discuss today?
And I am going to have to excuse myself, but thank y'all so much.
Yeah, so I think we've sort of reached a point where we might be able to hit a couple of these real quickly, but you may also need to formally table whatever we don't get to.
Right.
Until the next meeting. So, but I think we can say that I just gave my update on fields of study. I will point out that there was an interim hearing last week on transfer issues. And so that continues to be a focus, at least, of the Senate Higher Education Committee. And there was a fairly long, not as long as dual credit, but a fairly long discussion about transfer issues and so forth. And one of the legislative recommendations that we're going forward with, in addition to seeking some funding, particularly for small colleges, to be able to afford to send people to field of study, because you keep going back to the well over and over again. At some point, the college is it's going to be difficult for you to support this, and so we asked for some money to try to shore that up a little bit and help support the smaller colleges, especially those that are a great distance away. But the other is that we're also seeking some change, perhaps, in core curriculum. That was a lot of discussion came about around the core curriculum, and Dr. Gardner already mentioned that we have already proposed that we develop 4 to 6 sort of meta cores, if you will, or core concentrations, and so we think that's a pathway to help students a little earlier. Now that we have a lot of fields of study done, we can begin to go back and really look at the whole issue of meta majors and look at what is common across fields, and perhaps help with some advising chores there as well. But I don't know if any of you saw the testimony last week, but one of your fellow presidents referred to the core needs to be the core should be the core, should be the core, should be the core. And one of the things that we've gotten away from is that the core is not necessarily the basics anymore as we usually conceive of them, and that oftentimes contributes to transfer and applicability issues for students. So we have sort of embarked on both an internal quest to try to make the core more like general education basics that it should be, and also ask for some legislative help with that as well. So that covers item number 6.
Ron, maybe my notes, if, while we may not have covered the items by item number, I think we've covered everything except for 5, perhaps number 8, although we have talked about marketable skills a little bit, in number 9, and Jarrell Booker just rejoined us. So if you want to have him give a brief synopsis on both of his items, we could perhaps do that and still make 1 o'clock. Rex, do you need to speak more about marketable skills?
Well, the only real update on marketable skills is just a couple of things. One is that we will, I think we finally got the graphics and what have you completed on our career readiness handbook. So we've developed a handbook that would actually go to students, and hopefully both to high school students and even beginning college students, and encourage them early on to think about what it is they want to do, but to also really think about what kind of skills, what are the marketable skills they need to go into the kind of career that they want to go to, and make a better connection between that and the majors that they choose. And then the other thing I would highlight is that we will also have, we've sort of attached ourselves to one of the data fellows meeting, but in October, I believe it is, we will actually have a convening with business and industry to talk about marketable skills, because we think that one of the issues that we run into is that, and when I say, and I use business and industry in the broad term of business, industry, public service, anything and everything that a student can go and be employed in is included in that. But we think that oftentimes they use one set of language to describe the knowledge and skills they're looking for, and we use a different set of language to describe the knowledge and skills that we think students have exited with. We usually tend to put those in the language of student learning outcomes. And so part of what we want to do is talk to some folks with from business and industry in that broad spectrum to talk about how we at least have some translation of the language between the two, and then be able to turn around and help institutions as they continue to develop their marketable skills goals.
Booker?
Good afternoon, Jarrell Booker, Assistant Commissioner on College Readiness and Success. I'll be brief based off timing. The first part I'll deal with is House Bill 2223, dealing with co-requisite implementation around developmental ed. As many of you know, the legislators passed House Bill 2223 in the last session, to which institutions of higher education are required to offer co-requisite coursework for students that are underprepared, where they're taking a dev ed course and a college level course at the same time. The legislation also lays out implementation, so 25% of the folks in dev ed would have to be in 2018, 2019, 50% 2019, 2020, and then 75% in 2020, 2021. So we are on track with that implementation. We developed rules earlier this year, which the board passed. In addition to the legislative branch also gave us funding to help support institutions actually implementing any changes that need to be to scale up to 25, 50, and 75%. And we've just recently, the board just awarded those grants to institutions. About almost 70% of the institutions that receive funding were two-year colleges, so a lot of the colleges will be able to implement some of the things they had to do to make changes to address House Bill 2223. And we also awarded Austin Community College in a competitive process to be able to provide professional development across the state to help institutions that are struggling with ramping up and scaling their co-rec work. So you'll start to see that over the next year, where there'll be regional meetings and webinars and face-to-face meetings with the coordinating board to actually make sure we're helpful in implementation of House Bill 2223. So that's the brief part on that. You want me to go to the, is there any questions or? 2 minutes, I'll jump to it. I'll make it shorter. It's not even about minority males and college going rates. It's about males and college going rate. And just a couple of points I want to point out to you is, in order for us to hit our targets and goals, we have to get males completing. I think our goal is at 500,000 by 2030, to which males we're expecting that target to be 275,000. But what's happening is females are actually going to school and completing at a faster rate. Males are not. So there are some statistics that are showing that there should be some concern, and we have to look at it a little further to figure out why that's happening. And a couple of points I want to point out: the direct-to-college males are only going 47%, females 57%. You can see that sort of gap starting around 8th grade. So 8th grade, 10th grade, it gets bigger, and after that, it just keeps expanding and expanding. The next piece also is completion. Female completion rates outpace males considerably, to the point that Hispanic females are actually completing college at a higher rate than white males now. So to the extent that we can look at it a little further, figure out what's happening in our institutions and at K-12, it's something that bears us to pay more attention to, particularly as it relates to our 500,000 we're trying to hit for our completion target. That's it in an elevator speech, but I think you get the picture that it's a concern for us. We present it to the board, and it's a concern for them as well.
And you're still looking?
Still going to keep looking at it and trying to figure out ways to address that directly.
I was handed a note that on the issue of our recommendation, suggestion, I don't think we have any power but beyond that, that the coordinating board and TAC and CAT and TEA issue a statement of solid support of dual credit. I mean, we did it by consensus, but it was suggested we actually have a vote. I don't know if that's in the bylaws.
You can't vote.
We can't vote,
on that
okay.
Because it was an update, but they'll get the word on it. You don't have to worry about, it'll be shared with the commissioner, and the commissioner will need to talk with his chair and vice chair, and John, as our external relations, will weigh in. But it'll be passed on, but you don't have to vote. But anything that's on your agenda is an update. There can't be a vote.
Right.
This is the state rules, and
Are we allowed to endorse as a group?
And I think we all have the sense that unless one of you wants to tell us you're not for it, I would sense you're all for it, and we can pass that on, but you don't need to. In fact, legally, you can't do that, but we all heard.
Yes.
So
the tape will actually reflect, we did not vote on anything.
I actually spoke briefly with Brenda in the hallway as she
Okay.
was leaving, and we talked about that too, so we'll just have to. No, you're restricted to things that are on the agenda item and things that are referred to as an update. I mean, our board can't exercise
Can't do it
vote.
either.
You have similar things on your own boards.
I think that it's October the 25th is when the actual board is meeting to receive all
right.
these reports.
I'll double.
Anyway, I mean, just for informational purpose, if someone, would like to attend that meeting.
And all our meetings have been webcast for
Right.
20 years now, so
Right.
Can I make a
you're always
request?
welcome if you want to.
On this topic, is it possible that,
27.
Gary, you could send to the board, to this group, what the recommendation is or the presentation related to this topic? Because the coordinating board's going to have a lot of other topics that are beyond kind of what we're interested in.
And
But just so we can have a heads up of what you're taking forth?
Sure, and we don't know at this point. There was a recommendation made to the Senate yesterday, the 3 points, and John went over those briefly. But whether there'll be anything additionally coming forward, I don't know. We don't know what AIR's recommendations are. They haven't made recommendations. I can't honestly say if we will have recommendations at the committee meeting beyond that. It may be that they've gotten so much information, the board may want to wait till January, or we're still learning, and we don't even know at this point what changes AIR may make to their study based upon all the comments they've gotten. I think they've gotten comments from at least 1 or 2 people here today.
It's just courtesy. I'm not saying whatever's needed to be.
we'd
Just
be
a
glad to
courtesy.
let you know.
You got to post in advance, anyways. Just forward us the materials or the content.
And I'm just trying to make clear to you
Yeah,
that this
I'm
is
not
still a
expecting- just-
thing in
sure, it's fluid.
progress. And Jacob actually clarified for me the recommendation for the need-based aid, because he was on a leader for the task force, and their recommendation is not as nuanced as the association's is, and I think that makes a difference. So that was a reminder of that we're not going to try to split the money ways that it can't be split. And that's not our determination, it's the legislature.
Just to follow up, the AIRS report does say they're going to develop practical policy recommendations grounded in the report. They also say they're going to send a draft out for comment on those. So I assume that.
They sent I don't. Heather, is their schedule include sending out their? I mean, there's nothing to say that if we get the recommendations, we could.
I mean, again, they
When we get
specifically
them,
say, at this time, we will also share a draft set of policy recommendations that are grounded in research and informed by feedback received from the public. Interested stakeholders will have the opportunity to submit feedback on the draft recommendations.
Oh, okay.
So it looks like we will have that ability to look at their recommendations.
And Heather Marsh, Coordinating Board. AIR will be putting out a webinar in late September to share a summary of public comments and draft recommendations at that time.
There isn't a date on that yet, is there?
Sorry, no, they haven't set a date yet.
Heather, let's remember when we get a date to share it specifically with the members of this committee.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So this report, AR, the audience, the customer specifically is the coordinating board? Or did you chart them on behalf of the state? I mean, so are those recommendations effectively coming to the coordinating board, and then you get to choose how you want to respond to that?
Yes, we don't know what their recommendations are. We don't know if we will agree or disagree, and then staff may agree or disagree, and our board may disagree.
That's okay, but I'm just saying, the idea, I think, is
Know how that works.
Right, but you get to put your overlay as the customer, so to speak, of the report, even though it's funded by other sources,
Absolutely.
versus the recommendations are to the legislature, and then you have to try to, it seems like you're the customer, you take that input along with all the other things, and then you in turn make the recommendations to the state.
That's why we keep emphasizing, we've contracted with them to do a study. We're not anticipating controlling the output. We'd like to get it messaged better, but that doesn't mean we're not, don't have to adhere to all their recommendations. And I think that's one reason to have the major policy discussion I keep bringing up, because we don't know what they're going to be, and we felt it was important to hear other people's recommendations as well. And the commissioner might decide he wants to wait for our recommendations to our board until he's heard the board discussion. I really don't know where that will be, and I think we'll know more in 2 or 3 weeks after we see the final revision of the report.
Yeah, it's a Wednesday. It's the week after Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving comes early this year, but it's before the Fall Governor's Conference, the Fall Leadership Conference.
I'll belabor this. It seems like at that point, there's a chance, David, that you will have a set of recommendations. What have you formulated? Where do you think it's going to be? It may not be there, but if you've got not so much just the study and going rehashing it, but what does that mean for the higher ed coordinating board on that and other issues? What is the legislative agenda? What do you expect the key issues are? Where can we weigh in before, if there's something you've already taken to the co-board, or if you're going to take the co-board in January, what are those issues and topics that would be helpful to us to understand kind of what your position is based on all that?
Right. And generally I can say yes. It's still a little bit, I feel like I'm almost day to day on some of this. Several have spent several hours on this down at the legislature yesterday, and I think we're all sort of learning as we go forward from each other, and that's important. I do want to assure you that I at least from our perspective, I didn't imagine we would have any recommendations that would get down into, say, with advising exactly what everybody was supposed to be doing. If anything, it would be in very broad terms. So, but I'll tell you now, if we were to do something like that and you think it's too much in that vein, we want to know that. Because, we sit further away, and you're working with the students on a daily basis, and there are things we can't know as well as you do. So just be mindful we do understand that.
So I think I'm talking about funding. It's not just necessarily dual credit, just kind of this is what we anticipate the legislative agenda, because that's really the key going to the legislative, that we anticipate that the coordinated board will be proposing that will be affecting community and technical colleges across the state. Thanks.
So I think that'd be the number one item of discussion, and we'll just see how long it takes. And then we'll have the other items ready to go just in case. So anyway, I do want to thank the coordinating board staff for all your hard work and on all of these things, and the having live streamed, watch the testimony and everything yesterday. It was extremely interesting, and I think community colleges came out looking pretty good. So anyway, any other comments, suggestions? Not taking any questions. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you.